You might ask yourself, what's in a name? A person's name, a place name, a date? Here's a name for you. This is a rhyming riddle acrostic. Listen to the first letter of each line. What tearful torture made by war, in horrors, fears, and prisons, let freedom's scholar with the sword, like Oscar's hero vision, in mighty blows and lightning strokes make ward and fiend and quisling. Was needful cause ne'er fails nor falls, as autumn leaves when wizened, that he was sought no gain at all, lift Scotta's dream commission, and bind the oaths combined with force ere honoured meet for mission. William Wallace, the best known hero of the wars of Scottish independence. Names like Wollaston, just south of Falkirk. Many places in Scotland are named after him. What about Grahamston in Falkirk as well? Named after the hero John de Graham. John de Graham knew William Wallace from the time he was a child, because William Wallace himself was taught by the priest of Dunipace, who was John de Graham's uncle. But it was the 22nd of July, and the year was 1298. Edward Plantagenet, the King of England, Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, not been very pleased that his army had been decimated at the Battle of Stirling Brig, was looking for vengeance. His army were starving. Many of the English ships that had come north to Dunbar to feed his troops were starving because the ships couldn't get in. But they heard that Wallace was 40 miles away with an army at Falkirk. Elated, the 15,000 strong English army made their way westwards towards Falkirk, and Wallace and his men, with only 7,000 men, half the amount, waited on the hill. Edward was going to learn by his mistakes. Heavy cavalry as though he had, he put them in the front to come upon the Scots army, noticing a bog, a marsh underneath, a swamp, just like as it was at the Battle of the Brig. Realized he was not going to make the same mistake, but going to take the least line of expectation. His army of heavy cavalry on the front, and behind them the infantry, the men with the pikes, and behind them the longbowmen. The longbow was a secret weapon of the English and of the Welsh. 6 feet long it was. There was not a target it would not miss, even at as much as a range of up to half a mile. So powerful were those arrows, they could pierce the heavy metal shields of their enemies. William Wallace stood waiting with his men. Edward divided his cavalry into 2 divisions. The idea was they were going to go around the swamp and take the Scots on both flanks. But when they got round the bog, the English cavalry began to charge. And they charged at such a rate that the Scots stood their ground. But what did they charge upon but the Scots archers? Especially the right division and under Lord Hereford reached the Scottish archer lines and began to decimate them because the cavalry support of Sir John the Red Cummin had run away. They had fled the field, and the archers were cut to pieces. The only support that the Scots army had for the infantry and the cavalry. The English cavalry then turned around and began to attack the Scottish Shiltrons. But the Shiltrons, the men with the pikes, stood their ground like a great porcupine, a great hedgehog. They stabbed the horses into their guts. And Edward realized after a while they were gaining no ground. So he ordered his cavalry to retreat. And he called forward the infantry to march slowly. And behind them, the men with the long bows. And as they fired their arrows into the Shiltrons over the heads of the infantry, they began to fall like ninepins, defenseless against the English long arrows. And after 4 or 5 volleys, the bodies lay strewn on the ground. He called on his infantry to fight off the rest, and they fought very bravely. The Scots stood their ground in their Gowden circuit outfits as the English, wearing their bright red, wearing their breastplates, wearing their helmets. They fought bravely in the face of overwhelming odds. Edward then called for his infantry to retreat, and he called on the cavalry and decimated what was left of the Chilterns, and the Scots army began to flee. But Sir John de Graham, the great knight, was fighting an English knight, and he killed him. But little known to him was a little aperture there was in the back of his arm was left lying open, as it was to be with another great Graham 4 centuries later, Bonnie Dundee, John Graham at the Battle of Killiecrankie. In this case, it was a spear or a sword that entered it under his ribcage, and he fell dead. William Wallace came to the rescue of his friend. He fought through the English ranks, but when he got there, he realized it was too late. Well, Stuart of Bonkill and Bute, who had brought 1,000 men, also died. So did the Macduff Thane of Fife. After the battle was over, both Stuart of Bonkill and John de Graham were taken and buried in the old kirk, St Andrew's Parish Church in Falkirk. And that was the place from which the town got its name, called in the Gaelic language and Chiglish Brech, or the Speckled Church of the Falkirk, or the Falkirk. And that's where those two heroes lie today. And if you look on John de Graham's gravestone in the kirk in Falkirk, you will see engraved the following words: "Here lies Sir John de Graham, baith white and wise. Ane of the next were rescued Scotland thrice. In better necht the world was lent, nor gid Graham of truth and hardiment." Now the year was 1746. Bonnie Prince Charlie, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, was staying at Bannockburn House with Lord Hugh Patterson, courting his sweetheart, Clementina Walkingshaw. Oh, he wasn't called Bonnie for nothing, you know. We had a mighty army who were billeted in barns and in bothies, sleeping under trees round about on that January day of a very, very heavy winter in hard frost and snow. But soon his scouts could hear the drums beating in Falkirk tune. For General Hawley, or Hingen Hawley as they called him, was staying at Callender House in Falkirk. And when they heard the news that the army was there, Bonnie Prince Charlie quickly mustered his men. He took Lord Drummond's regiment, Lord Ogilvy's, the Irish pickets, Lord Kilmarnock's, and many more, especially cavalry, and told them to go in 3 ranks through the woods of Torwood, the very same place where William Wallace, centuries before, had recovered from almost drowning, and the same place where King Robert the Bruce had planned his infamous Battle of Bannockburn. Well, that was not lost to them. But they stood in the hill above Falkirk, beating drums and playing pipes, building campfires, making sure they would be heard. Hawley seemed to be completely unfazed. But what he didn't know was there was another part of the army waiting elsewhere under Lord George Murray, the commander of the Arthur Brigade and second in command of the Jacobite army. They had made their way to Linlithgow and helped themselves to some good ordnance and supplies under the nose of Hawley. Anyway, just to make sure, General Hawley sent up some troops under Cobham and some troops under Ligonier and Lord Hamilton up towards the woods to see what was happening. But quietly, what seemed to be the whole Jacobite army melted back into the woods. Hawley was being entertained by Anne Livingston, the Countess of Kilmarnock, who was of great Jacobite sympathy, who kept him occupied with more wine and hospitality. But little known to him was that Lord George Murray was behind the hill to the southwest with an army of 4,700 Highlanders. Oh, on the left, the Camerons of Lochiel, 800 men. Oh, and next to them, Clonchatan with the Macintoshes. Next to them, Clooney Macpherson, the MacGregors, and 3 armies of MacDonalds of Clanranald, Keppoch, and Glengarry. And they formed up upon the moor as the weather began to turn, sleet and rain driving into their faces. But the Highlanders were clever. They had their flintlocks under their plates to keep the gunpowder dry. And Hawley got news of this mighty army on the hill at Falkirk, and he began to panic. And he gave the order for his men to muster on the hill as quickly as possible, for he had 8,000 men. He left in such a hurry, he left his hat behind in Callander House, I was told. Well, they formed up with their infantry and even some Highlanders on their side. Oh yes, the Earl of Argyll with his Campbells. Loudon 64th and the Black Watch, being captained by Angus McIntosh, whose wife, by the way, Lady Anne, was on the other side, commanding the clan against him. In fact, she ended up taking her own husband prisoner. It's a true story. Well, both armies faced each other. Hawley gave orders that the left of the Hanoverian army were to charge Ligoniers, Hamiltons, Cobhams. And into the MacDonalds they went, and the command of Clanranald stood coolly, without flinching, preparing their flintlocks, waiting till the horse were within 10 paces of them and fired. And immediately 90 of the cavalry fell to the ground. Some of the horses began to charge through them. And as in the Battle of Sheriff Muir 31 years before, Clanranald men drew their dirks and stabbed them into the horses' bellies, ripping their guts open, and then pulling down the riders and dispatching them in the field. The enemy began to flee in panic as the Highlanders did their great charge, 2,000 MacDonalds in all, as the bard said, "Nor the year is Clanton, nor you and Hagarag, na bio vi her vod, hun cos for Nakarav, look haste of Nakora canors to live Yarag, Mogog and Begod of life Toshigakarav." The MacDonalds, those fierce thunderbolts, those stout lions, whose right it was to use the red hand, my lord, it would be folly for them to fall upon you. Such a panic was Lord Hamilton's regiment that he himself fled and run over some civilians and scattered the 1,500 men of Lord Glasgow's volunteers, and they chased them all the way back into Falkirk. Running faster than the horses, these MacDonalds were fit men. I pity anyone who had to come across them with their claymores in their hands as they drew out their cold steel and their Lochaber axes. But the left wing was a different story, because now they were short of men. They noticed the Camerons were undefended by sufficient cavalry support. So O'Sullivan, one of the commanders, gave orders that Lord Ogilvy's and the Irish pickets, 1,200 men in all, were to go to the left side of the field to protect the Camerons, who again, just like the MacDonalds, they under their chief, the gentle Lochiel, waited for the enemy to come upon them, fired off their flintlocks, drew out their cold steel, and charged. And all these enemies, these great English regiments, Lord Howers and Barrels and all the rest of them, fled before the enemy. And even the men of the Argylls at the back, including Donochaban MacNeil, the great bard, who chuckled as he ran away, because every Highlander was a Jacobite at heart, knowing the Jacobites had won, as the bodies piled up in the ravine where the monument is now. But during the course of the battle, there was a man called Robert Munro of the 37th Foot. He was on the other side. He was leading an English regiment and a very respected man in the Highlands. During the course of the battle, some of the Camerons veered across to the right side of the field and into the centre. They came across him, and he fought them bravely with a half pike in his hand until one of the Camerons shot him. Probably didn't recognize him. And then another one stabbed him 3 times through the head with a sword, killed him. His brother David came to the rescue, and he was also killed. And on the pursuit, Lord Murray cried, he says, "Tonight I will sleep in Falkirk or in paradise," as they took the town. But when all was over, the Highland dead were buried in great mass graves up where the monument is now. But the following day, as the men of Clanranald were cleaning their guns after the battle in the town near Callendar House, a terrible tragedy happened. A young man of the Clanranald regiment, his musket went off and killed the chief of Glengarry. They demanded justice. Otherwise, the 800 men of Glengarry were going to go home, and Bonnie Prince Charlie could not afford to lose them. So the father of the man who had killed them offered to shoot his own son. And he put his own son against the wall, pulled his blue bonnet over his eyes, and fired and killed him with his Doon pistol. That evening, Glengarry was buried at the old kirk of Falkirk, and a special ceremony and a special funeral service was laid on for Sir Robert Munro. Although he was on the other side, it was organised by the Earl of Cromarty, who'd been on the Jacobite side, because every Highlander honoured each other. And so from that day until this, there lies in that grave Sir Robert Munro. And his personal tartan, the green and blue tartan, was adopted from the independent regiments and became the tartan of the Black Watch and the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, the government tartan. And that was the tartan of Sir Robert Munro, who died of his wounds at the Battle of Falkirk in 1746. So if you go to Falkirk, the old kirk to this day, you will see the graves of Glengarry MacDonald, who died of his wounds, who died of the young man, Sir Robert Munro, Sir John de Graham, and Stuart of Bonkill, who died in these battles. And so goes the tale of the 12 battles and the old kirk.